Hi, folks. Welcome to this wonderful impromptu interview that I'm going to be doing with Andy Ngo and Peter Boghossian, two Portland exiles. So I suppose we'll be talking about Portland. Right, so just as a quick thing, are you both Portland born and bred, are you?
I'm not.
I am.
You are.
I
Okay.
am.
No, I moved there in 99.
Right, so but you've been there for a long time.
Yeah, and it was a fantastic city. It was a very livable, clean, safe, wonderful city.
I mean, when I visited in 2017,
Yeah.
it was a clean, safe,
Yeah.
very
and
middle
you
class.
lived with me.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It was a wonderful place.
Yeah.
And I was very impressed. And so, to be honest, there was a part of me that was like, I'm not surprised these guys have got quite far left, eccentric luxury beliefs. But man, it seems that it really has gone downhill in the last couple of years.
Yes, that stems a lot from the riots of 2020 that really brought in a whole number of like consequences way beyond the riots. 'Cause the riots they ended in after like 7 months.
I mean, that's a long time.
It is very long.
'Cause it was like 100 straight days of rioting, wasn't it?
120 straight days, and then it became about twice weekly, then once a week, then monthly, until it trailed off.
Literally like a festival.
Yeah, but it was
wasn't
deadly.
just the riots. I would argue that it was the response to the riots.
Yeah.
I would say that's more accurate.
Okay,
yes.
tell us about the response, because I assume it was just generally permissive.
Well, let me rephrase. It wasn't just about the riots. It was about the lack of response to the riots.
Yeah, so I was there undercover at that time. I was gathering observations for my book, Unmasked, which I've talked about on your show in 2021. The response, though, from the local government was to completely enable and to legitimize those actions. The long consequences, there are a few, I would say. One, it helped normalize a culture of just criminality in public.
Exactly.
And then on top of that, you had many police officers who resigned or transferred to other agencies because Portland became such a hostile place for police. So even when after the whole defund the police thing happened and then they were refunded, the damage was already done. The money is there, but law enforcement recruits are not willing to apply in Portland for many reasons. And so with that, you have really excessive wait times for emergency 911 phone calls. And short, basically, of a life or death situation, you are really not going to get a police response. So all the things around robberies, thefts, street violence, you're not going to get a police response. And with that, and just a permissive environment politically for lawlessness, and we had an explosion of homeless encampments, which ebbs and flows. But from 2020 till now, I think it's probably the worst it's ever been in Portland.
I think in the last 8 months or so, it's not been as bad. The city is, along with some rich donors, have started initiatives to clean up the city. I've often wondered, so the mayor is unbelievably unpopular, and
Yes.
the mayor, a woman named Sarah Irioni, do you remember her? Yeah, I believe she put ABD PhD in her. All but dissertation does not make you have a PhD.
Sarah Inaroni was a communist woman who ran against Ted Wheeler in 2020.
She's the one
Yes.
who wore the Maoist skirt.
You remember that?
I do,
Exactly.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
correct. That's correct.
Portland, for me, is something of a fascinating case study. Because I remember very clearly in 2017, 2018, when Ted Wheeler was trying to court Antifa.
He, him.
Yeah, him. He was trying to speak at their rallies, and they ended up booing him out, shaming him out, and then setting his apartment on fire.
Yeah, his apartment in the Pearl District, and the consequence of that is he went to his $1 million home in the Northwest, right?
We don't know where he is now, but he left
Once they set the lobby of his building on fire.
Yeah.
Right. So there is something.
It was Antifa who did that, by the way.
Yeah,
not the
there's
far
something
right.
very symbolic in that, right?
Yeah.
Like here's a.
The left-wing facilitator of the communist revolutionaries tries to ingratiate himself with the communist revolutionaries and then gets violently chased out of his own city. There's something very symbolic about
and
this.
I think that the larger lesson here, I think the mistake is that many either on the left or people who would self-describe them as centrist believe that there can be some kind of appeasement and then a rapprochement with people when the fact they already hate you, there is no appeasement. But the other thing that's operative there is that he's rich and he comes from a very wealthy family and he can just move, unlike most middle-class people and virtually all, if not all, people from the lower classes. They just don't have that opportunity. So if someone set their building on fire, they're just out of luck. They have to go to a shelter.
Did Portland get an autonomous zone?
Yes, it did. So,
Excuse me.
in
So I know Seattle did. I couldn't remember if
Yes.
Portland did. Right.
There was one in the summer of 2020 in Seattle, the infamous Chaz, Capitol
yeah.
Hill Autonomous Zone. Then by December of 2020, the Antifa in Portland tried to create their own autonomous zone modeled after Chaz. It was much smaller. They called it RHAZ, R-H-A-Z, Red House Autonomous Zone. It was centered around this house in North Portland. They had booby traps set up. The whole road was just blocked off, the whole street. It went on for a few weeks, and the city, just like during the riots, just allowed it to go on, and then it eventually fizzled out because of, infighting and issues that always happen with these far left groups.
Was anyone murdered in it, like in the Chaz?
No.
I don't think so. There were rumors of unreported rapes and assaults, but I don't think anybody was murdered.
Nobody was killed at the Portland Autonomous Zone. It's too small.
Right. Okay. And so the local government was just totally permissive of all this, right?
It was, but maybe the confusion about the murder comes from the fact that there was a murder during the summer of 2020 in Portland. Yeah. That was the murder of a Trump supporter by a self-described 100% Antifa. Those were his words on his manifesto.
Yeah. He was shot.
He shot the Trump supporter in downtown Portland during one of the Antifa riots, then fled out of state to Washington State, close to Olympia.
So this is the guy who got a favorable interview with Vice magazine.
That's right, when he was on the run.
Yes.
And nobody knew who he was. Yeah. He gave, journalists at Vice knew where this fugitive was. Yeah. He died in a shootout with police. And I wrote about this in my book, but there were multiple instances where he had been actually arrested by law enforcement in the state of Oregon and was just let out, including at one of the riots a number of weeks before he went on to murder somebody. He illegally had a firearm, right. And he was just let out. I mean, this was the big issues. Riots were happening every night. Hundreds of people were being arrested every week, and the cases were just dismissed or dropped. This is a matter of policy by the prosecution.
This is very, very important. So my whole life, I've just assumed that everybody's just going to do the job and their system's going to plug along, right? Sure. The police are going to arrest criminals. The court is going to, the judiciary is basically going to say, are they innocent, are they guilty? Sure. The penal system is going to imprison, and the probation system is going to mediate that. When any branch of that breaks down, the whole system collapses. And I just always took it for granted. So in the beginning of the riots in particular, there were not a lot of prosecutions. And I think that's what alienated many of the police, because they were arresting people, and the district attorney, and I think he's changed his tune, we could talk about that, Mike Schmidt, was simply not prosecuting people. And that gave the entire city the feeling of lawlessness, right?
That's a good reason.
And it emboldened people. They just knew that nothing was going to happen to them.
But city council actually took measures to specifically make law enforcement less effective during the riots. For example, banning them from cooperating with federal law enforcement. They actually passed resolutions. Portland police could not cooperate in any way with the federal law enforcement.
And remember, Trump was in office at the time, and Ted Wheeler, him is a leftist.
Yeah.
And the far left also engaged in lawfare. They're very good at that. So they sued the Portland police, accusing them of using excessive force. So then, what's happened is that Portland police are banned from using tear gas and impact munitions.
Right.
So the only tools they have now for a long time now to respond to the riots was batons and pepper spray. And when you're dealing with a mob of hundreds and thousands. Yeah. So then they actually it was very clear they pulled back after a number of months from responding. I don't know if I speculate that that was an official reaction to basically them not having any tools. But then this is why it went on for so long. When people ask me, how do you have riots that go on that long? It's because it was completely, the rioters were able to act with impunity. The
Also,
far left rioters.
Yeah, I was going to say about the far left thing, because that's the other side of the question, right? Because there's one thing, the authorities not cracking down on massive violent riots, right? That's one thing, smashing up innocent people's property and all this sort of stuff. But there's also got to be a motivating force to make people go out and riot in the first place. And it's worth talking about that, isn't it? Like, what is motivating them for 120 days straight to go out and riot?
Well, ostensibly it was for racial justice because of George Floyd, but it was an opportunity for violent anarchists, narcissistic extremists, and communists to have a free-for-all in public. There was a study that was just published in, I think the journal is Current Psychology, and it's a quantitative study looking at personality traits of political extremists, and one, according to the academic authors of this article, they found that narcissistic and violent psychopathy traits are predictors of also having far left extremist views. This is completely unsurprising to any of us who's been covering this. It's nice to see there's at least now some
science
academic research to back that up. But so you had ideologues that were spearheading a lot of the organizing, and you had a lot of riffraff who showed up, including homeless people. These were kind of like these were a lot of the people who arrested, basically the fodder, the people who just showed up, were given the explosives to throw, given the weapons to use, and if they were arrested and on the rare chance prosecuted, the people behind them would never be exposed.
And there'd also be people to like pay their bail and things like that, assuming it came to that. So you can see how, in the case of Portland, the entire system seems to actually be set up to encourage and facilitate the rioters.
You only need one facet of the system to not work. That's all you need for the breakdown of the system.
Because going back to your your assumption that, well, the system will just work, right? The people within it will just do what they're expected to do.
Naive assumption now.
Well, is it naive? Because, I mean, normally the people within an institution work towards the internal goal of the institution. Like,
Correct.
You know, the justice system, people are working to get to what they believe to be a just conclusion. But in the university, they want educated people. There's an internal goal to the institution, and it's not unreasonable or naive to think that the people involved will be working towards that goal.
Okay, so would you want to take that?
Go ahead.
Well, there are many ways to look at it. Here's one way to look at it, is that diversity, equity, and inclusion are universal solvents, and they destroy everything they touch. And one of the consequences is the mission of institutions change, and they change from doing what they're supposed to be doing, arresting criminals, prosecuting criminals, incarcerating criminals, adjudicating, or what have you. It changes to an equity-based system. So, for example, racial sentencing, racial hiring among police. And once the North Star of the institution is lost, the primary mission, it just goes off mission.
Yeah, it gets an external goal.
It has another goal, and both of those goals. I mean, how does one hierarchically prioritize when those goals are in competition? So that's one way to look at it. There are two others, but
I would argue that in 2020 and before that, during the Trump years, that the actions of the violent street thugs, whatever they organized under, was in line actually with the Democrat establishment in places like Oregon and Washington State. Not entirely. I mean, Antifa believe in actually literally overthrowing the state.
Yeah.
However, Antifa and BLM were very useful as sort of street thugs in enforcing violently, basically Democrat orthodoxy around social justice beliefs. Do you disagree with that?
Well, no, I think that's completely true. There's a kind of a sort of river of principles that they're all operating, they're all sailing down, right? They all agree that they want social justice, racial equality, sexual equality, liberation, all that sort of thing.
Let me pick a bone with both things you have said. So yes, I'll give it to you that's primarily found among Democrats, but that's value that's parasitized itself onto traditional democratic institutions. I mean, that's not the value of the old leftist. I mean, I'm just thinking anecdotally about my father or the people in his generation. And if you said, hey, there are these people who are going to be rioting, what do you think should happen to them? You don't know if they have a good reason for rioting or not. It's blue collar Democrat. People, he would say, well, what do you mean? What should happen?
But you're talking about the average Democrat voter. I'm talking about the elected
yes, I'm
Democrat
talking about the
politicians.
average Democrat voter.
Look at city council. Let's just focus on Oregon. Look at who is in city council and what they said. And at the county level, and then at the state level, our senators, our lawmakers at the time.
No, I'm talking about the voter on the street, like this somebody who's been a blue collar Democrat.
So I think I see exactly the issue here, right? Because this seems to be the ideological capture of the elites against the interest of the base, right? Because we have very much the same sort of thing in Britain with the Labour Party, which is honestly, it's almost a carbon copy of what's happening in America with the Democrats. As in the Labour Party would have lower class, working class people who would be considered to be socially conservative. They weren't ideological socialists.
Right.
They just wanted to make sure that their interests were represented because they didn't want to be exploited by big business, by international corporations, by the state itself, by aristocracies, whatever it is. Because, they work hard, they pay their taxes, they expect law and order, they're decent, hardworking people. They aren't woke progressives. Right, woke progressives are very much a new and different phenomenon to what they would call in, say, our father's generation, socialism. Right, it's not the same thing, and this ideology captures the elites. It weaponizes the institutions against these very people. And that's why for Brexit, for example, the North ended up voting for the Conservative Party because the North was socially conservative. And what that means in England is sovereignty. They want to be away from the European Union. Whereas all of the middle classes, the educated middle classes, don't understand why the working classes see this as a vote in their own interests. The vote to keep the power closer to where they are. And this schism has been just unbelievably open here.
So here's the other thing that happened since George Floyd. I think two other factors are operative. One, I think you see a version of the Ferguson effect. And so police officers will not arrest. In fact, I was just in New York City before I came to the island here, and a bunch of transit police were standing around in New York, and I'm trying to think of the best way to say this. I just know no politic way to say this. African Americans were just jumping the turnstile. Sure. I mean, they would just jump in mass, and the transit police were literally right. And I was just watching the transit police talk among themselves and watch them, and I do think that there is a concern, and I've spoken to police officers about this, that they don't want to be perceived as being racist.
Completely.
And I'm not saying that that's right or wrong. I'm not justifying they're not. I'm just saying that this is a phenomenon, and I think you see the large-scale George Floyd effect. Not George Floyd.
Ferguson effect.
Ferguson effect, excuse me.
Well, and officers don't want to be put in a situation where an unpredictable suspect then makes them be the next Derek Chauvin.
Right.
And I mean that's quite an extreme outcome. But even before that, you can see what happened.
No, but it's the threat of that, right?
Yeah, people,
or even much more
threat.
mild, like that New York hospital worker who. These black youths were trying to take away the bike that she had purchased, and then she was and her family were hounded as the racist and targeted by probably thousands of people online through these social media campaigns. And that was an instance where she was a victim of a attempted crime.
And I think that, and I can't speak to how it is here. I just learned today, you said the black population is 3%.
In this country,
And so I think that there is these equity-based initiatives and Americans' mind on equity. Everybody is so hyper-racially conscious right now. Yeah. And I think that bleeds through the system.
But what I was getting at, though, is the sort of traditional blue voters. They're going to be people who view law and order as a process, right? Okay. They view the act of jumping the turnstile as the act itself is criminally punishable, right? And so they will be like, well, I don't really care who does it. That person has to be punished. Whereas the the people in charge now are looking at spreadsheets and are looking at disparate outcomes, and will say, well, the act itself isn't actually very important. What's important is that we have an equality here, or else there is racism and the system itself is corrupt.
Okay, so this is, to me, one of the most fascinating turns of the last few years that nobody talks about. And that is how arresting rioters, if I say I believe people who riot and destroy whatever they want to destroy, whether for good reason or bad, if you're rioting in a U.S. city, I think you should be arrested.
Sure.
The narrative then becomes you're a conservative or you're a Republican.
Well, there we go.
And that to me is fascinating.
Which I think
That
speaks
is
to the
totally ahistorical.
It's the but it shows the shift to the left and the capture of the ideology. And there's on the right at the moment, there's a big discussion about managerialism and the very nature of it. And if you read James Burnham's The Managerial Revolution, you end up with this kind of idea that actually this was kind of inevitable, right? Because the proliferation of data through society and the strength of the state at the moment, which is totally supported by the left, even when they claim not to support it, it kind of makes it inevitable that the people at the top will say, well, look, we have all of these, like the sort of managerial tools that Hitler would have been envious of, right? like we
have to edit that out.
No,
I'm just
no.
kidding. Go ahead.
You know,
go
but
ahead.
I'm not joking. But it's funny, but it's true, right?
I know.
Hitler or Mussolini, any totalitarian dictator of the 20th century would be like, God, if only I had that level of information, level of being able to monitor people, cameras on every corner. You know, the data that electronically comes in about like what you eat, where you go, it's all on your phone. It's all trapped on the grid. It all comes together. And if you've got this in God knows what kind of spreadsheets, all of this laid out, well, it's inevitable that you'll end up with a kind of managerial philosophy to go with it, because actually you see yourself as like the director of society. So now we need to stop people smoking because too many people are dying of lung cancer. It's like, well, it's not unjust actually. They chose to smoke. They enjoyed their smoking. They got lung cancer. They died.
And those are the social credit, the critics of the social credit.
Exactly. And you end up with this need for a managerial philosophy, and then wokeism comes along and says, well, actually, we've got the perfect managerial philosophy.
Yeah.
It's ultimately moral. You know, no one is on the side, no one's pro-racism. And so, no one's pro-sexism. No one's pro any of the bad things that we're told that come as a consequence of the sort of natural and organic moving in society that people do, right? And so if you're a manager, you've got a series of spreadsheets where it's uneven distributions. The only explanation you have for those is racism, because, of course, having a different explanation is racist in and of itself.
No, the only explanation is it's racism, it's systemic racism. It's the system.
Yeah, of course. It's
And then once you get that, then you can change words accordingly.
And if you're in charge of the system,
minoritized,
But if you're in charge of the system, you're like, yeah, great, I can just change the system. And so if part of the system is arresting black people for jumping over turnstiles, you can rationalize any kind of reason why. Well, hang on a second. If we do that, that's going to increase the black people in prison, and that's bad for my columns. So we can't have that, you know. So they have to be let go because they're black.
And there's something about the system of policing in certain neighborhoods that lead to those outcomes.
Absolutely.
Right.
And then when you ask the people on the ground, go to the black communities and say, would you like more or less police? They say more. Every time, almost 90% of them say more. And so
that data is in. We just did a podcast with him, Matt Thornton's The Gift of Violence, and one of the things that he says in that book that I thought was so interesting is that men, one can dislike this fact, but this is a fact. Men have radically disproportionate rates of contact with the police, but no one says the police is anti-male.
Everyone knows that men are more violent.
Right.
It's not
so
wrong
the reason that police are in certain neighborhoods, it's not, and I'm not saying every police officer is.
Every police officer is anti-male.
Right. It's not that they're harboring.
Some of my best friends are men.
It's not that they're harboring an animus against people in those communities. It's that's where more of the crime occurs, and the consequences of pulling out those police is that the crime in those neighborhoods will increase, and the people who are hurt, it's not me. It's not middle-class white guys.
No, it's the black
community. It's the people in those neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Well, we have the national data from the increases across the U.S. in urban areas of homicides following 2020.
Correct.
And that's why now they have to attack the moral legitimacy of the categories themselves. The fact that you think it's wrong to live in a high crime neighborhood is white privilege, white supremacy.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.